Well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar, 3 Budget Blunders to Avoid. My name is Kirk Kovieski, Vice President with First Service Residential, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Certainly, first, with any technology platform, in the webinar setting that we have here today, there is always a potential for technical difficulties, right? Technology is never perfect. So while we certainly don't anticipate any at this time, we appreciate your patience and your consideration if they do arise. As much as we have facilitated so many of these, especially in the past several months, given our new dynamic, not always perfect, so we appreciate your patience. Also, please do feel free to take notes, but this webinar is being recorded. So you will be contacted by our marketing team following the meeting today to get access to the full webinar once we're finished today. And then finally, if you would please, keep your microphones muted during the webinar. This cuts down on background noise, as well as any distractions that might come during the webinar while we're presenting. And you will have an opportunity to submit questions at the end of the presentation via the chat box on the right side of your screen. Okay. All righty, so our presenters today for our webinar are myself, Kirk Kovieski, and as I mentioned, I will be your moderator, but we are also joined today by Lauren Starner and Shauna Gatlin, Regional Directors at First Service Residential. So I'd like to take a couple of quick minutes here before we start to have both Shauna and Lauren introduce themselves. If you would, ladies, please share a little bit about yourself, your position, how long you've been with First Service, and you know what, just for fun and to keep this light and conversational, since we are in the midst of a crazy heat wave here in the Western United States, why don't you share with us your favorite ice cream, little personal tidbit about each one of you. So Lauren, why don't you go first?
Well, thank you, Kirk. Good morning, everybody. My name is Lauren Starner, and as Kirk mentioned, I am a regional director here at First Service Residential. I am just shy of my 10-year mark with the company, and my focus here is in large-scale management and teams with sited management and their teams. And I must say, I am very boring, I should say, and my favorite ice cream color is vanilla.
Well, that's good.
I'll be off guard with that one.
No, well, you gotta keep you on your toes, Lauren. But that, that allows you for you to like any kind of fruit or candy or toppings, right? So perfect.
I like to mix it all in, but keep vanilla the platform.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, Shauna, how about you?
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Shauna Gatlin, like Kirk introduced, and I am from Santa Clarita. I have been with the company a little over 13 years. I am focusing on single-family home, large master planned communities. We have a nice team over here, and we're always looking for more of those large master plans. And my favorite ice cream flavor is very specific. It is amaretto cherry cordial ice cream. If you haven't had it and you're Italian, shame on you. And if you haven't had it and you're non-Italian, then go try it.
That's great. Now, where are we going to find that, Shauna?
You can find that at Ralph's, and it's in the private selection, always on sale aisle.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that's a good thing, and that's a great segue into my favorite ice cream. So my introduction, Kirk Kovieski, like I said, Vice President. I've been with the company now. I've been going on 15 years. And since the beginning of my career, I have worked predominantly with the large-scale master planned, amenity-driven communities, anywhere from 1,500 upwards of 6,000 homes, as well as our high-rise division properties. So that's my background. So I, too, am a big fan of a private selection ice cream. And it is a sea salt caramel truffle ice cream. So it's vanilla ice cream with caramel swirls and then chocolate covered caramel pieces. And, in my house, we buy two separate ones because there's certain members of my household that like to go into it and eat just a little chocolate covered truffles out of it and leave the ice cream, swimming by itself. So yeah, so if you haven't tried that, certainly go pick it up. You can get it at a Ralph's or a Fry's or any Kroger brand store. So excellent. Well, thank you, ladies, for that. And let's jump into the presentation itself. Before we do that, though, what I would like to do is just give you a little quick introduction about First Service and who we are. So you'll see on the screen here, we do have a mission statement. Deliver exceptional service and solutions that enhance the value of every property and the lifestyle of every resident in the communities we manage. This is our mission statement that every associate in First Service lives and breathes by day in and day out. And as the leading residential property management company in North America, our business is building and managing happy, healthy, expertly run communities. So we do aim to improve resident lifestyles, enhance property values, and at the end of the day, deliver that exceptional service to all the communities we serve. We've been in business for over 40 years and serving pretty much most, if not all, of the West's premier communities across California, Arizona, and Nevada. And we are honored to have a portfolio of over 1,400 associations in the Western United States. So our goal of these webinars is to share best practices and to keep your community's interest in mind. And now, before we do officially move on to the content, I do also want to take this time to share a quick legal disclaimer that this webinar is provided for information purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Okay. So our agenda for today, we're going to have talk about 3 different budget blunders. Budget blunder, easy for me to say. Budget blunder number 1 is avoiding assessment increases. Blunder number 2, not funding reserves properly. And blunder number 3, surface level budget planning. Like I mentioned earlier, we will also have a time for a Q&A, which you will facilitate via the chat function on the webinar here. And then we'll talk a little bit about the resources going forward that you all will have access to following the webinar. So I will kick it off talking about our first budget blunder, which quite frankly can have some really big consequences. So the first budget blunder is to avoid assessment increases, right? So oftentimes in my experience in working with boards, there's kind of this mindset like, well, we don't want to be the board that raises assessments. And so I like to bring up a couple questions pertaining to this when we're talking about assessment increases. So here's some things to consider. By not raising assessments, are we actually helping or are we hurting the community? Are current residents happier when we keep assessments stable instead of increasing them? No one wants increased costs, right? And then will potential residents, potential buyers into our community be less inclined to purchase if there is any pending or ongoing assessment increases? So let's keep those in mind as we go through my little part of the presentation today. So what are some of the risks? Listed a couple of them here on the screen. These are probably the big 3. Certainly there's many, many more for us to consider, but for the purposes of today's presentation, let's talk about these 3 top risks. By not increasing assessments on a clear, regular, consistent basis, or on an as-needed basis as your community evolves and certainly cost of living increases, one of the potential risks is a decline in property values, right? So what do our assessments go to? Typically 2 things: operating funds for the day in and day out maintenance of the community, and reserve funds, right? A certain percentage that gets put into reserve funds. And we'll talk about, reserve funds and assessment increases a little bit later. So by not increasing assessments on a regular basis or on a usual as needed basis, then if you are not adequately funding your operating costs that go towards maintaining landscaping, go towards maintaining your clubhouse, go towards maintaining proper administrative function levels, by not doing that, are you truly keeping the community nice and pristine, and that curb value, that curb appeal that we always want to think about as we keep our community relative? So there's that potential decline in property values. Okay, so let's say we go a couple of years because we want to be a great board and we want to be the board that never raises assessments, right? Puff our chest a little bit. Sounds good in the moment, but what about when, let's say we haven't raised assessments in 3 years and then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, operating costs have gone up. Perhaps we've spent a lot in reserves and now we have to additionally fund reserves. Now all of a sudden, instead of a clear and concise, maybe regular 2 to 3% assessment increase year over year, now we're looking at maybe 5, 7, or 10% all in one big jump. It's hard enough, right, to communicate assessment increases, let alone having to explain the reason why and justify a large jump rather than a clear, consistent message year over year of increasing assessments on a regular basis. And then finally, the deferred maintenance and possible increased insurance costs. So we're not raising assessments on a regular basis. We're not funding our operating account adequately to maintain the level of maintenance that we need to. Then all of a sudden we're 3 years down the road and we've just been putting a Band-Aid on things. Now all of a sudden, boom, instead of maintaining the facility, let's call it maybe the pool area and the different facilities around the pool, if we're not maintaining those and we're just putting Band-Aids on those things, now all of a sudden that deferred maintenance becomes one big expense, probably out of reserves. But if we had been maintaining it, perhaps the useful life of that component of that asset would go much longer than it would have been had we not waited and deferred that maintenance. And the increased insurance costs that go along with any potential liability for not properly maintaining assets and deferring maintenance because you don't want to increase your assessments. So those are certainly probably the biggest 3 risks to keep in mind now. So let me tell you a little bit of a real life story that I actually was intimately involved in. Back in 2015, one of our high-rise communities, luxury high-rise community, a couple hundred units, they had not raised their assessments in 7 years. And this is a high-rise just like any other high-rise, right? Elevators, boilers, chillers, underground garage parking, pool, spa, fitness center. And while 7 years ago they were in a great financial position, different iterations of the board, to be perfectly honest with you, were those boards kind of puffing their chests saying, we don't want to raise assessments and look how great we are by not raising assessments. So come 2015, after not having raised assessments in 7 years, that community, that building, that high rise was put in a position where they had some very significant reserve expenses. They had tried to the best of their ability to cut operational costs because they weren't raising assessments. We got to a point at the end of the day that we had to go have a conversation with this board and be very transparent to say, because of boards before you, we only have limited options to 1, adequately fund your operating account, and 2, get your reserves to where they need to be. So at this time, you'll see on the bullet point here, the 3rd bullet point, at the time, the reserves were only 36% funded. We ended up having to do a couple of different things. One, for the period of about 8 months in 2015, we had to stop funding the reserves to the tune of about $10,000 a month in order to adequately fund operating funds. Now, that was just a temporary solution. What we ended up doing, and this is probably the number one thing, the number one takeaway, it's in my next slide with best practices, what we ended up having to do is to be fully transparent with the owners in the community, in the high rise, to let them know that, hey, first of all, this is the position we're in. But yes, it kind of stinks that this is our position, but guess what? We have a plan. First Service, as the management company, in partnership with the high rise and with the board, we sat down and mapped out a very clear and concise plan for getting them to where they need to be. So long story short, after developing this plan, we were able to put this 3-year plan in place where we had to have the tough conversations about raising assessments 10% every year for the next 3 years. Had multiple town hall meetings to explain the why behind the what to the residents, and ended up after that, through that 3-year period, we took the reserve funds from 36% up to 70% in 3 years. And we are happy to say that they just did a complete renovation of the lobby, of the pool area, brand new gate for the garage, maintaining high quality facility in the past several years. And now they are currently sitting, even with all these renovations, at an 80% reserve funded level. And since the 10% increases in up to 2018, that board has clear and consistently raised their assessments every year from 3% to 5% just because costs go up. And they, knock wood, will never be in that position again. So what are some of the best practices? I mentioned it. Be gradual, be consistent, avoiding that dramatic increase and those unexpected changes. And quite frankly, if you're in this position, just be open about it, be transparent about it. You know what? Here's where we're at, but put together a clear and concise solution and a plan, and explain the why, not only behind the circumstances, but the why behind where we're going and how we're going to get there. So in partnership with your management company, with your management team, with First Service Residential, as difficult as that situation can be, if you keep in mind the risks, keep in mind the story of what could happen, kind of worst case scenario, and keep in mind these best practices, you will be much more well positioned to not be in a problem situation in the first place. So that being said, I'd like to now turn it over to Lauren. And Lauren, if you will, tell us about your budget blunder number 2, not funding reserves properly.
So healthy reserves. So our next budget blunder is not funding reserves properly. So what is a healthy reserve? It's not always a magic number or a percentage, but specifically for an association, are there enough financial resources available to complete the major repairs or replacements on the common elements and components of a study? So what does that not look like? Not funding the reserves properly. If you don't have those financial resources, there's some serious and sometimes detrimental consequences for the membership. And so there are questions as a board that you want to consider right off the bat. And first and foremost, I would ask, how familiar is your board with its reserve study? And when did you review it last? Are you ensuring that the reserves are properly funded for expenses, whether those expenses are planned or unforeseen, unplanned? And do you conduct regular reviews of your budget to ensure that the reserves are going to meet expenses? And so this review should be happening on an ongoing basis and at least at an annual level through the budget process. So it's so important, as Kirk mentioned previously, to really lean into your reserve study specialist and your management and really ensure that you're understanding all of the recommended contributions and how they are going to impact your overall assessments and funding levels. So if you answered no to any of those questions, or if you're not reviewing your study often enough, there are definitely going to be risks that are going to take place. So some of your risks are obviously going to be surprise maintenance costs or special assessments. So these can be significant and damaging to a community, especially when the membership can't afford a special assessment. So you might not have been raising your assessments incrementally because you felt like the membership couldn't afford them, but they're definitely not going to be able to afford a larger special assessment all at once. So it could also mean deferred maintenance and a decline in property values. And it could also lead to low resident approval or support. So essentially, the board may have a lot of unhappy constituents in their properties who feel blindsided when they feel the upkeep and repairs have not been tended to properly. So these are some of the major risks associated with not funding the reserves properly. And to really paint the picture for you, I'd like to share a couple of stories of some real life scenarios that have taken place. So first and foremost, this one is a doozy. In prior years, we took over management of a community that was 100% investor owned, and it was neglected, to say the least, for quite some time. They only had $1,000 in operating, and I will beat that 36 or 32% funded because they had $0 of funding in their reserve account. It was quite a scary situation. So this was actually a 2-story condominium building, and it was over 20 years old. And essentially, within the first few months of management, all of the major components needed to be inspected. The majority of them had to be redone, replaced, or repaired. And these weren't small ticket items. I'm talking all of the landscape was dead. Grass is now dirt. Roof tiles are falling off, so your roof needs to be repaired. All of your irrigation needs to be repaired. 100 palm trees that hadn't been trimmed in years. Buildings needing to be repainted, asphalt needing to be redone. The pool was out of code. It needed to be replastered. We needed new filters. We needed a new drinking fountain. Fences were falling over. So to say there was neglect is an understatement. So after we had all of these components evaluated, we had a new reserve study done, and we worked real close with that reserve study specialist to come up with a 5 to 10 year plan, because we knew this wasn't going to happen all at once. So our goal was to not only bring their reserves back up to adequately funded, but we obviously needed to get these replacements and repairs done. So that was the next step. So we came up with a 3 to 5 year plan to get all of the items corrected with a special reserve assessment. So once the board approved that assessment, now the campaigning started. So we individually called all of the community residents, and we had to explain the funding situation to them. We had to explain where they were and why it was so important to put this into place and why they were going to have to pay this money for the next 5 years. We're talking a small community, so this was thousands of dollars for each community member over a period of time. And as the reserve money came in, we knocked out the project. We got all the bids taken care of, and one by one, starting with the most needing to be replaced, we knocked those off the list. And at the end of 3 years, all of the major components were repaired or replaced as needed. But we weren't done yet. So at the end of 5 years, their reserves were 50% funded. And happy to say that at the end of 7 years, their reserves were just about 70% funded. But as I mentioned, this took a lot of communication, a lot of thinking outside the box to get buy-in, both from the board and from the owners, and just really keeping those lines of communication open with all parties. So progress reports on a monthly basis. And whenever there was a new owner in the community, we actually picked up the phone and we called them. And we explained to them the same history we'd explained during our initial campaign of where we had come from and where we were going with these assessments and why it was so important to the community. I will say at the end of the 7 years that not only were they 70% funded, but their unit values had doubled. And this was right amidst a recession. So while most property values were declining, this community actually was increasing, which was a phenomenal feat for them. So I have a second story of a blunder as well, similar in nature, where a group of investors held a majority of the seats on the board, and they determined that they wanted to sell their 90 units. So in order to make the sale more attractive, over time they voted to reduce assessments, and they had this in place for what appeared to be about 3 to 4 years. So while assessments are decreasing, the community is aging, and during that time frame, they spent 2/3 of the community's reserve account monies without replenishing it. So they wanted to spruce up the property, so they did things like adding landscape enhancements and repainting buildings, which in theory is great, but they also had other major components scheduled for replacement, which they didn't do. The reserve study said they needed to be done. They ignored them, or they received a Band-Aid treatment at best. There's no evidence that management tried to dissuade them from doing this, and so what has occurred has been lasting repercussions, and the investors essentially sold their properties and walked away, and they left the community drastically underfunded with aged out and faulty components and just in a really dire state. So fortunately and unfortunately, we've come in and we've taken over management, and the community is still slowly gaining traction through annual incremental increases in their assessment, because the members can't afford a large special assessment in the way they could in the first scenario. So unfortunately for this community, they're still having the repercussions of what these investors did to the community. But fortunately, we do have plans in place to get them where they need to go. So although these are two drastic scenarios, they do lead to some best practices that every community board should be considering. And in addition to reviewing your reserve study regularly, partner with your management team, your reserve study specialist, and your budget committees if you have them to develop a calendar of predicted reserve expenses. So I would recommend putting this together with an annual calendar and reviewing at least on a quarterly basis. Refresh and update your reserve study on a regular basis. So this is not only updating your reserve study when it's legally required, but also when major projects are accomplished or when something is done that has a significant impact to the community, because not every study is going to show what the actual expenditure is going to be. Some things might be more and some things might be less. But by staying on top of this and staying on top of your reserves and your anticipated expenses, you're going to be far less likely to experience the negative fluctuations or those drastic scenarios and budget blunders that we talked about in the examples.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lauren. You know, it's really timely in any season, certainly sharing about, you know, the reserve topic. We did a 2019 First Service did a nationwide board effectiveness survey, and our survey found that 85% of all the board members we surveyed said that having a healthy reserve was their highest priority, right? So definitely great information. And, you know, had I known in advance we were going to have a competition on, you know, the biggest worst case scenario story, I would have maybe found one, you know, that was, you know, a little more extreme. But, you know, you're in the lead so far, Lauren, so good for you. Thank you.
I don't know if you're going to find one more extreme than that, Kirk.
No, that's definitely pretty extreme. So thank you again, Lauren. Appreciate you taking the time to share that information. So now I want to turn it over to Shauna. And Shauna, with our budget blunder number 3, you have some fantastic advice to share regarding the third one we want to highlight, which is telling us about your experience with budget planning blunders.
Yes, thank you, Kirk. So now we know don't not increase your assessments. I like to use the rule of thumb that you'd rather tell everybody when you're increasing those assessments that it's the cost of a Starbucks, because everyone can afford just one more Starbucks, versus something much larger. That's just not a fun conversation to have. And then we want to keep our reserves healthy. And then what do you do about budget planning? That's what I'm going to talk about. That's my budget blunder. So the first item to consider is how often are you looking at your budget? Are you taking a detailed and consistent look at it on a monthly or an annual basis? You know, I know a lot of boards have really great treasurers, and then the other directors might just lean on that person. But the whole board should be looking at the financials every single month. It's so important. It's you should kind of know it and know what's happening, not at budget season that you have a problem with your water bill or you have a problem with something, but throughout the year so that you can fix it and obviously save money. The other thing is, how far into the future do we look? Do you look at the next 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? And I would say option D, which is all of the above. We should be looking forward in the short term, in the long term, and the in-between. On the slide, it talks about a survey where it says 38% of board members say they regularly review their financials and have a good handle on their best budget practices, which is scary from a manager's point of view. We would hope that's much farther up and that most boards are looking at them regularly, but that's what came back. And really, a lot of you should be in your budget planning right now, or at least getting started with it. We have our majority of associations are in their budget calendar year end, so they have a December year end, and now's the time to start working on that. If your management team hasn't already started it, now's the time. So this is very timely. So essentially, what are the risks if you're not doing proper budget planning and you're just doing it on the surface and kind of checking the boxes of what the civil code or law requires? The first one is insufficient operating funds. This is obviously a problem. It's just like our own bank accounts. We don't want to live paycheck to paycheck. We want to have a few months of assessment revenue sitting in the bank accounts. We want to be able to pay vendors or pay that insurance premium that may come once a year. So we definitely want to make sure that your operating funds are there and we're able to write checks for you. Unstable vendor and utility costs. The utility cost is an easy one. You see something that's weird on your financials, looking at it month by month, these can be red flags. You can see that there's a major problem on your slopes that you wouldn't know about on your irrigation and your landscaper is not picking up on, but you have this crazy water bill or your gas bill is really high from a broken pool heater. So those are great examples of why you can be looking at these financials and they're giving you clues as to something that's going on in your association. And unstable vendors, if you're having something where your vendor is giving you, their costs are all over the place, that's a conversation you need to have. And being able to plan your budget and talk to your vendors every year and really know where your money's going is really going to help you in the long run. And then an inaccurate picture of current and future financials. So there are those budgets that we see that are very broad. The categories are all lumped together, and you really don't know where the money is going. And so budget planning and taking an in-depth look at your budget and being able to categorize things where you know where your money is going is going to give you that accurate picture of your financials and allows you to plan for the future so that you're not in one of these terrible scenarios that we're all trying to find the absolute worst. So I'm going to talk about an association and what could happen and what you don't want to happen to you and your association. It is not as bad as Lauren, so I will say that. But it is a older 30-year-old condominium community. We love to pick on them, sadly. It was an apartment conversion complex, and plumbing was the main issue. This association was just bleeding money. They were fixing leaks regularly. Their plumber was becoming a local. He knew the names of residents, which is a really great thing for customer service and a really bad thing for your bank account. That means that your plumber's there way too often. And they were budget planning for Band-Aids. So they were just putting a Band-Aid on the plumbing. The board and the management company that they had was thinking very short term. They were thinking just how they can stop the bleeding. Not permanently, like I said, just putting a Band-Aid on it. And so when our team came in, we saw that their reserves were not well funded. They were in the 17% area, and it wasn't enough money inside the reserves to be able to pay for the large plumbing project that needed to happen. I mean, the words repipe were a little taboo in the neighborhood because everyone had their own idea of how much that was going to cost individually. Homeowners, the word special assessments weren't spoken. You just didn't talk about it. But after a lot of communication and education, I think Kirk mentioned that earlier, and I am a huge advocate of educating your members, talking to them. They will, most people are reasonable once you communicate with them what's going on. Why do we have to do this? So they had a large education campaign, many town hall meetings, got the numbers for repiping. They went through, should we do a copper repipe or some other kind of repipe? They laid it all out there for all the residents, got a loan, and got a special assessment approved. I mean, the approval rating after educating people, I think was above, far above the requirement in their governing documents. The result after this was, after 5 years, the association continued to increase their reserves. I think they're up to in the high 70s now, which is great for them, for an older community that still has other large reserve and maintenance expenses, keeping their dues down so that they, can keep their property values up. We know it's a juggling act. But the key takeaway there was not putting their head in the sand, really planning for long-term success, making those hard decisions that, as long as you have the conversation and educate your residents, we think the majority of them, the reasonable ones, will understand, and just doing what's right. I do have one more example that's not on the slide that I'll quickly just talk about, and I think everyone can relate to it. Even if you're not a apartment conversion condo community, I had an association with a lake. A beautiful lake that had cranes and lots of wildlife in it, and there's a small amount of vendors that will maintain those lakes. And we had a vendor that, talking about an unstable vendor and their costs, it was every month, it could be $1,000, $3,000. The board just didn't know what was going on. So they took their best practice and met with the vendor, had the conversation, wanted to know why. And they did this early on in the process. They didn't wait year after year. So that's why it's so important to look at your financials every single month. They were able to see, like, why is this happening? Sometimes it's for good cause, and sometimes it's because you just have a bad vendor. And in this scenario, it was the latter. There was a bad vendor. We were able to get another lake maintenance vendor that had a set dollar amount that was under $1,000 a month, and we've, after 10 years, literally never had a spike in that fee, which is crazy compared to what we were spending, which was sometimes $1,000 up, sometimes $5,000, with some crazy explanation with had to do with algae or bacteria or something inside the lake. So, you know, talk to your vendors, look at your budget and your financials month by month, and really make those good choices. And so for best practices, you know, we talk about the what if scenarios and potential future expenses. I say just, you know, always look, don't be afraid to make those tough decisions. Don't just look at the short term. Don't, you know, ask yourself if this is a Band-Aid or if you are really treating the problem on a permanent level. And what are the expenses that we could have in the future, you know, as the community matures. And then work with your management company to ensure you have a draft and a recommended budget in advance of the meeting. So sometimes your budget draft is not going to be great the first time because the conversation leads to other goals that the board may have or new knowledge that they didn't have when we created the draft budget. So it's going to take some time, so don't wait till that last minute to approve it in a rush to mail it out to the members. You know, spend some time meeting, you know, meet a couple times and really get a solid budget that you guys will know, and then you can look at month after month and plan for the future. And I think that's all I got.
Excellent, excellent. Well, very, very great information, ladies. And so before we open it up for Q&A, what I'd like to do is just do a quick review, right? It's been about a half hour, 40 minutes since we've been talking about our budget blunders. So by way of review, here's our three budget blunders, right? Avoiding assessment increases, not funding reserves properly, and the mindset of just surface level budget planning. So here's what I'd like to do. Shauna and Lauren, think about this while I talk about like the two biggest takeaways from my budget blunder, right? So think about yours. Folks, what I would tell you is the two biggest takeaway from, you know, the avoiding the assessment increases is this. One, it should be done on a regular basis, right? Cost of living goes up. Depending on the type of community that you're a board member at, more than likely there's a good amount of assets, and assets are going to fail. If it's a high rise with elevators and underground parking, if it's a master plan community with facilities and pools and spas and fitness center, or a condo community that has multiple buildings with multiple roofs and maybe it's gated. Costs are not going down, costs are going up. So why wouldn't it serve to figure that our assessments would go up in the very minimum just to cover operating increases? And oh, by the way, utility costs aren't going down either. So big takeaway number one is to get into a mindset, into a habit of regular recurring assessment increases, even if it's only in the low, you know, 2 to 3 or 4% year over year. And then being consistent with those assessment increases. My second biggest takeaway is communicate the why behind the what. Basically, that's HOA management or board management 101 anyways, right? We always want to over communicate and not under communicate. We would much rather have our homeowners telling us, okay, stop telling me why we're raising assessments, as opposed to constantly pinning you down as a board member at the mailbox or emailing management, why are our assessments going up, right? So clear, consistent, regular, recurring assessments, and adequately, clearly, and concisely on a regular basis communicate the why behind the what. Lauren, what would you tell us are your two biggest takeaways from not funding reserves properly?
So first and foremost, get that copy of your reserve study in your hands and review it and update it regularly. So have that plan, have that reserve study, and have it be a constant review and update as things are happening in the community. And the second one would be to really partner and lean into your specialists and your management recommendations, because they are giving them in the best interest of the community. So if your experts are recommending a funding level, understand why and really lean into that. And if you disagree with it, have the conversation. Don't just not fund the reserve.
Excellent, excellent. Good. Two big things to remember. And then finally, if you would, please, Shauna, with surface level budget planning, give us your two biggest takeaways.
Yeah, so I say the first takeaway is definitely kind of what I feel I'm a broken record saying, which is review your financials regularly, know your budget, know where your money is going month by month, look for those red flags. So, if you're not looking at your budget, there's a problem right there. So that's definitely the number one takeaway. The number two takeaway is something that we all take pretty seriously into heart at First Service. It's one of our core values, which is to do what's right. You're going to have to make that tough decision potentially to raise assessments, to special assess like the association that had to not put Band-Aids on anymore and really take out a loan, do the tough work. But do what's right for the community and know that in the end, the association, the homeowners will appreciate you for it. It can be hard, but it's worth it. And then over communicate, and then it'll be fine.
Absolutely. Great. Fantastic. Again, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Shauna. So at this time, we'd like to open up the meeting to Q&A. And so attendees, you do have the option on the right side of your screen in a chat box to type in your questions. And then as questions come in, I, as the moderator facilitator, will kind of delegate those out to whether it's myself, Lauren, or Shauna to get those questions answered. Now, also, given that we want to be cognizant of everyone's time, we try to keep the meeting to about an hour or so. If we don't get to answering your questions live today, we do have your contact information that you used when you registered for the webinar. So if we don't get to your question today, we will take note of it and we will respond to your question with an answer following the webinar today. Okay, so folks, at this time, please go ahead and submit your questions. Okay, so we do have some great questions coming in. Let's start here. Mr. Morrison, Seth Morrison, thank you for submitting this. Mr. Morrison says, the hard question is how do we determine what a good percentage of reserve funding is appropriate? Wow, if we had a nickel for every time boards asked us that, right? It would be awesome. I would have a much fancier background here when we get those questions. So how do we decide? So Lauren, since your presentation was about reserves, why don't you go ahead and answer that one?
Yeah, so nickel every time we get asked, that is so true because it's not always the same for every community. So unfortunately, I wish there was just a magic percentage that meant it was great funding, but you really need to work individually with your specialist to look at your community and look at how you're funding your reserve accounts. What method are they using, and really it's, do you have enough money to fund your component? So unfortunately, it's not a magic number, but it really will depend specific to your association and working with your specialist to identify what that target level and percentage level should be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's hard because we often get asked that question, whether it's reserves or, it's really hard because no community is exactly the same, right? And even then, from a reserve standpoint, I know especially like in the high-rise world, I might have two very similar high-rises with similar assets and, same number of units and pools and spas and fitness centers and garage parking and elevators, except one of them might be a couple of years older and they've been funding reserves at a higher percentage. So while on the surface it might look like, well, maybe our reserves should be the same as them, there are so many other factors that go into it that don't make it an exact science. But the other thing too, Mr. Morrison, to keep in mind, and this comes from the National Trade Organization that kind of the reserve specialist world belongs to. There's a range that the national organization has put in place that basically says if your reserves are 0 to 30% funded, that's considered a poor position. 30 to 70% funded is considered a fair position, and then 70% or higher is considered a good position. Now, granted, the fair position, 30% to 70% is a wide range. But the other thing with those three different percentage ranges, is that it serves to figure if you're only 0 to 30% in a poor, you have a much higher possibility of a special assessment if you're 30% or lower. 30 to 70%, that likelihood of a special assessment decreases significantly. And then 70% or higher, I can tell you in my 15 years have never seen a special assessment in an association that is funded 70% or higher. So hopefully, Mr. Morrison, that answers your question. All right, so next question. Let's see here. We're getting some great ones here. So again, reminder, if we don't get to them all, please know that we will get to you after the fact. Okay, so Shauna, here's a question about the budget from Stephen Long. Thank you, Mr. Long, for submitting this. What level of contingency should possibly be factored into an annual budget?
Well, that's a great question. Contingencies, again, are based on the components of your association. I've seen associations that have large contingencies based on because they had a lot of slopes that they just needed to have that extra cushion for potential issues that they just weren't aware of. You know, I'm not a big fan of contingencies because it's kind of just like a safeguard to making sure that, you know, you're not knowing your budget intimately, so you're giving yourself that cushion. But I know there's need for it as well. So it depends on your assets. If we're talking slopes, those are unpredictable. If you're talking high rises that have unpredictable things, then yeah, I see that there's a need for contingencies, but there's no magic number. Again, I'm sorry, I can't say a percentage, but I'm not a big fan of contingencies. I think you need to really intimately know your budget, know what your expenses are, get in there every single month and figure it out.
Good point. Thank you very much for that, Shauna. Next question, Mr. Smith, Douglas Smith, thank you for submitting. Focus seems to be on increasing assessments. What is being done to look at operating expenses and reducing those expenses? Great question, and I appreciate you surfacing that. I'll take that one. Because those two go hand in hand, right? On one hand, my part of the presentation was focusing on that kind of regular, recurring, potentially 3 to 5% assessment increase. At the same time, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. So parallel to the thought process of even just a minimum increase year over year, you as a board in partnership with your management team, your general manager, your community manager, your management company, on a regular ongoing basis, not only annually for the budget, but quite frankly, month to month, should be looking at whatever you can do to reduce operating expenses. So some of those best practices is, and some boards clearly have a policy that says, you know, our annual recurring contracts over a certain dollar amount automatically go out to bid. That's one way to look at it. One of the things that I have found successful, not only currently, but when I was a boots on the ground manager, one of the things that I was really passionate about in terms of reducing those expenses is why not go to your large vendors, which typically are, you know, your, if you have a third party maintenance contractor, especially in a high rise, certainly landscaping, probably for most of us in the master plan communities are some of the largest, is why not have a conversation with those vendors? Hopefully you've got a great relationship to start with, but why not have a conversation about, hey, let's look at a 3-year contract, right? Let's look at locking in a 3-year price, right? It's a win-win for everybody. We as the association, we know, one, we can negotiate a good price, and we will know for the next 3 years what our expenses will be. And number two, for the contractor, right, they're locking in a customer for 3 years. So doing that, certainly the negotiating, just because, you know, they're a vendor of yours, you hold the power, right? Vendors want the business, especially those larger contracts, right? So don't hesitate to negotiate those contracts. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest things in terms of looking at reducing those expenses. And then also as it relates to your reserve funds, because, you know, the deferred maintenance mindset, make sure that you are keeping a preventative maintenance mindset, right? Being proactive in the maintenance of your facilities, because even though reserves are you know, for maintain, replace, and upgrade your assets, a preventative maintenance mindset on an ongoing monthly basis is going to reduce those big jumps down the road for replacing assets or having to contribute further to your reserves. So that's definitely a great way in terms of not only maintaining but reducing operating costs, is to ensure that you have a great preventative maintenance plan in place for your assets. Okay.
I want to jump in real quick and just make sure. I think the 3-year contract is an excellent idea, but also just with the little condition that you check your governing documents, because there are some that say you can't go into that. So just want to make sure you do that.
Good point. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's see here. Another reserves question. And this is, Mr. Long, I apologize. I'm looking at questions first. So I'll tell you what, since this would be your second question in a row, Mr. Long, that's a great question, but I'd like to give someone else an opportunity. Perhaps we'll have time to come back to that. Okay. But it does look like this is another reserves question. So from David Kingston, Mr. Kingston, let's see. I am treasurer for our HOA. Congratulations on that. We conducted a detailed reserve study every year. In this study, we carefully reflect upcoming need replacements and additions. We maintain our reserves at 100%. Congratulations on that. I have been told by some members that 100% is too high of a level to carry. What is your opinion on this? So Lauren, why don't you take it?
So I would want to look at the study and see if you go out in, the next few years, are you going above 100%? Because at that point, you might have a caveat in your documents that requires that, you give, if you're over 100% funding, are you giving that back to the membership, or what's the caveat in your location that you would have to do with that money? I think having 100% funded is great because you can replace all of your reserve components, but you do want to make sure that you're monitoring those levels so you're not drastically exceeding the 100% as well.
Excellent. Excellent.
One more comment I have is that I've had associations that looked really great on paper. They've had over the 100% mark and they were patting themselves on the back for doing that. But when you dug into the study, you could see that it was missing some components, or it wasn't accurately describing those components. So the study is only as good as what's contained therein. So sometimes you want to make sure, like, we're at 100% and we don't have a ton of money, but we have a lot of assets. There could be something wrong there.
It's a really great point.
Ooh, and I promise we didn't plan this, folks. So perfect segue on that point into Naomi Casillas. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Naomi's question is this: hello, we are a new community getting ready for our first budget out of developer control. Can you give us an idea of what a healthy reserve should look like? So Shauna, why don't you piggyback on what you just mentioned?
So your reserve study percentage funding and what is healthy is based on what the component inventory includes and what they've created those asset values to be. So it's, you want to know your percent funded is the reserve analysts have decided you should have X number of dollars in your reserve account to replace your assets over time, usually over the 30-year period. And so you want to make sure that the components are correct. That's actually the most important part of the study, is that these components accurately show what it is that's in your community, and they have prices attached to them and useful life, the years left in those components properly defined, so that's kind of where the health of the study is. It's not so much on whether you have a 70%, 100%, or whatever. It's whether or not you have just a really great study that's detailed and has all those components listed in them and has their proper, what is the pool heater 5 years old or 2 years old? There's a lot, there could be misinformation. If you've gone and had different management companies, sometimes, information could transfer improperly, or, boards turn over and there's not that institutional knowledge to meet with the analysts. So when you have that on-site study with the analysts, which is, your governing documents and the law dictates how often that happens, you really want to meet with that analyst, go over all the components with them. That's what I would suggest as that new board from the developer controlled board, is to have that conversation with the analyst, but you don't have to wait until that study is required. You can go and meet with them and just make sure that that study is exactly reflective of what's in your community.
And Kirk, can I also just add to Shauna's point before about those vendor relationships? you have vendors other than your reserve study who can help identify what the replacement value cost should be and what their useful life is. So I've seen where, fitness facilities, your fitness vendor can come in and help you determine what the life and cost expectancy should be. So lean into them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And depending on, on the west side, they use national average numbers a lot on these studies on useful life. And we have less weather in the west than they do in the east. So sometimes your vendors that are local know a little bit more than what the reserve companies or insurance company use as the replacement values or life terms of these the components.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, ladies. Okay, another question. Marty Keel had a question, and I'll take this one because it speaks directly to, and I promise this question is not from a board member in the community that I told my little real life horror story about. We have not had an assessment increase in over 8 years. It has become ingrained in the lore of the community. How do we break through the barrier and start regular assessments? That's the crux of my presentation, in that, we sometimes maybe 2, 3 years, 4 years into it, prior boards, right? It makes us as the board look really good, or us as an association to the outside world, maybe to realtors or potential buyers that, hey, look at our community, we haven't had to raise assessments. But now you're in a position where you need to break through the barrier, right? Tear off the Band-Aid. So going directly to my points from my presentation is, first and foremost is have a clear, adequate, transparent conversation with your owners to strictly say, be straightforward about it. Look, folks, here's the position we're in. We get it. We've been doing really, really well. Kudos to us, or kudos to prior boards that we haven't had to raise your assessments. But the reality is we need to do it. I would even propose, whether it's you mentioning this webinar directly, or you as doing your fiduciary duty as a great, involved, engaged board member, saying, look, we've been doing some research, and while it's been good for 8 years, this is probably not best practice. And so to truly break through that barrier, it's to explain to the membership the why behind the what. Don't let that assessment increase happen in a vacuum. Right? Explain the why behind the what. Depending on the nature and dynamic of your community, could it be an initial email blast that explains the position? Could it be in concert with an email blast? Maybe certainly in today's COVID-19 social distancing world, we're not having town halls with 100 people in the clubhouse, but maybe let's hold a town hall meeting to be transparent and say, look, folks, here's where we're at. Let's hold your hand through this tearing the Band-Aid off. Quick, with my 4-year-old grandson, right? Here we go, we're gonna tear the Band-Aid off, 1, 2, and then before I get to 3, I actually tear the Band-Aid off, right? So it's being transparent, being communicative, the why behind the what, and keep it consistent. Don't just do one town hall and think we're good, right? If it's a regular recurring monthly town hall, or a bi-weekly email communication, just really preparing folks. And we all know at the end of the day, we're not going to clearly to every single member. Not every single member is going to get the message, and invariably the member who doesn't get the message is going to be the member who contacts us as management, or contacts you, a board member, at the mailbox and says, in November, what the heck? We're raising assessments, and meanwhile you've been communicating for the past 4 months. The vocal minority that we all deal with. So clear, consistent, get it out there, be transparent, and just be completely open about the why behind the what. All right.
And some free cookies and food, by the way. I was just going to say that, it sounds silly, but luring people in with maybe some free fresh fruit and orange juice on a morning. Shockingly, people love free food, and that will get them there, so you can educate.
Free food. And you know what? That's a great point. And I'll tell you, here's another thing. I know a lot of boards have success in engaging owners on any different level, whether it's a survey, or, hey, we want to build up our email base because electronic communications are going these days. Hey, attend the upcoming webinar where we're going to talk about assessments in the coming year's budget, and all those who register are entered into a drawing for a $100 Visa gift card, right? You know, I'll log in and sign up and hang out for a few minutes just to win a $100 Visa gift card. So great idea, Lauren. And anything and everything that you can do ethically and legally to get folks to participate is the way to go. So one more question. Because we are now to our time limit, and let's see, I kind of wish there was a powder puff question, like, you know, what is your favorite topping for your vanilla ice cream, Lauren? But let's go with this one. Last but not least, one of our major expenses, and this is from Matt Gaiman, one of our major expenses is painting common area block walls, 5 miles worth. Whew, been there, done that. It occurs about every 7 years. Is it always better to build this into reserves rather than considering it a special assessment? Easy for me to say. Rather than considering it a special assessment, and quite frankly, who ever likes to actually say those words out loud? Or is reserves always a smarter way to go to manage that expense? So I think there's a two-parter here, right? Because it relates directly to budget. It also relates to reserves. So Lauren, why don't you take this first? Shauna, you piggyback on it as it relates to budget, operating versus reserves, and then we'll finish it up from there.
So more often than not, your expense is going to happen at one time, so you're going to need that money. With reserves, you've been planning for it for a period of time. Also, the whole community, the people who are moving in and moving out, are paying for it over a period of time. Whereas when you have a special assessment, you're hitting the people that live in the community at that moment in time for the bulk amount. And you know, so I would always say put it in the reserve fund, unless you had some extenuating circumstance where in your community the special assessment made more sense for you just off face value without knowing anything about the community other than that. My call would be reserves.
And I actually agree with Lauren. It's a short and sweet.
No, that's a great response. And you know, maybe Lauren, a little bit to your point, my experience in having done that, if it's every 7 years and there's 5 miles, maybe there might be just a thought, planting the seed, right? Maybe there's a mindset to not unlike maybe the Golden Gate Bridge, right? They start on one end, and by the time they finish on that end, they're back to, you know, the other end. So, you know, putting together, hopefully with your painting contractor, you have a plan in place for when that happens and how it happens, which can certainly factor into how you are paying and when you are paying for that project, you know, out of reserves rather than that special assessment. So great answers and great questions. And thank you all. Again, please be reminded that we have logged in the questions that you have asked that we haven't answered. So please keep in mind that we will be communicating to you all, answering those questions for you. So folks, want to thank you all very, very much for attending. Lauren and Shauna, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to share the best practices and the insights with us. And certainly thank you all for your attendees attending this webinar. I saw at last count, we were upwards about 190 attendees. So we know you all are busy, and more likely than not, especially in today's environment, your HOA responsibilities as a board member are not tops on the priority list. So kudos to you. From those of us as professionals in the industry that really do take the time to get educated and to be much more effective, thought-minded, engaged board members on behalf of all the members and your entire association. So please feel free, you can see on the screen here, to check out our resource libraries in the links above if you're interested in additional best practices and insights. So we will be also sending a recording of the webinar, as well as, you know, you'll have this information here. So please let us know if you have any other additional questions that we haven't been able to get to today. We are super, super passionate about educating board members and you being successful in your roles. So last but certainly not least, folks, in today's world, best wishes from all of us at First Service for health for you, your family members, your friends, your neighbors, health and happiness. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much, folks. Have a great day.
Thank you.